Hi, I'm Daryl Lancaster for Threads Magazine. Bound buttonholes are, to me, the king of sewing techniques, and when you can make a series of beautiful, even bound buttonholes, your garment will rise above anything that most of your friends can put together, even from a commercial garment. There is something precision and clean and thoughtful and finished about a bound buttonhole. When I learned to tailor back when I was in my teens, there was an unwritten rule that when you put a machine-made buttonhole in a garment, it was really meant for things that were very thin weight, like blouses or shirtwaist dresses, where there was only a couple layers of fabric. And you might have a very thin layer of an interfacing like a silk organza. But a machine-made buttonhole was really meant to just create an opening in the garment for the button. When you get to outerwear, there was an unwritten rule that I was taught that you would never put a machine-made buttonhole in outerwear. Because of the layers of support inside, what ends up happening is that you put a wound in the fabric. And I've always thought of that through my years of tailoring. So the bound buttonhole is really about finishing that fabric so that it's clean, there are no raw edges, there is no wound in the fabric. I have a number of garments here. This is a white wool, and I have used the same fabric to make the buttonholes. The size of the buttonhole lips is actually pretty subjective. In the 1960s, when I learned, we made our lips about 1/8 inch wide, and they were pretty thin. And they did the job, but the heavier you make the lips in this direction, you will find the more of a statement that the piece makes. The length of the buttonhole is based on the size of the button. And typically, you would select the length based on the diameter of the button, the thickness of the button, plus a little bit of ease. You want to make sure that the button can smoothly enter and exit the buttonhole without any distortion. Likewise, bound buttonholes could also be placed on the cuff. If you want a fully functioning vent, go ahead and place them here. But I will tell you, it's a little bit tricky to get into those tight spots here. In this coat here, I have put bound buttonholes in, and I've used a contrast. I've used the same camel hair that I used for the coordinating fabric. So whether you want them to match or coordinate, that's your choice. In this jacket here, I've actually used the same fabric, but because it was a stripe, and I was really concerned about where the stripe would occur in the actual lip, I opted to do something I was taught very early on in my tailoring training, and that was to put the fabric on the bias. Now, that causes some issues because you don't want your buttonhole lips to be very givey or stretchy. So I was taught to then support the back of the buttonhole lips with something that would stabilize it on grain. Here I've actually fused a piece of fusible interfacing behind the lips so that they don't give or distort when the garment is buttoned. Here's another example of putting the buttonhole lips on the bias with a contrasting fabric. And this is using a solid fabric against the stripe. There are many ways to put bound buttonholes into a garment. And I learned a specific technique from my mom. I've only found it written in one other source. It is a very, very long set of steps, the method I was taught. But in all of my teaching, I found that this particular method, although there are a lot of steps, each step is very doable and very straightforward. And the huge advantage of this method, which I call the strip method, is that each of the buttonholes start and stop on the same warp thread and lie parallel to a weft thread. And it is much better for keeping your buttonholes consistent and even, and that is the goal. Now, the interesting thing with bound buttonholes is once I've cut my garment out and I've transferred my tailor's tax markings to the parts that I need to have identified for match purposes, the first step, and of course I always stay stitch, so once the stay stitching is done around neck edges and those areas are stabilized, the next step would be to create your bound buttonholes, which seems very unusual because normally we think of buttonholes as one of the last steps that we do in a garment. The problem is that when you wait till the end, it's much harder when the whole garment is constructed to be able to put in a series of buttonholes. It is so much easier to work when your bodice front is still flat. That means you need to know what the button size is before you start. And if you're like me, I like to wait till the garment is finished and then go button shopping. So this requires good knowledge or a general idea of what size button you're using so that you can make an appropriate size buttonhole.